Well, good evening, everybody, and I welcome you to the LSE public lecture on Islamic finance. My name is William Blair. I'm a High Court judge here in London. I'm presently the judge in charge of the Commercial Court here in London, which, as you probably know, is a very busy international court. And I'm also a visiting professor here at the LSE. So it's a huge pleasure for me to be here. And as always, we've got an excellent turnout this evening. Just before I introduce our two distinguished speakers, let me mention that this is the 10th LSE public lecture on Islamic finance. And this has now become something of an event that we have every year. If I may, I'd like to pay a personal tribute to Professor Nazim Ali. He headed up the Harvard Islamic Finance Project for some 19 years. He's now a professor and director of the Center for Islamic Economics and Finance at the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies in Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. And we do owe a lot to him for the work he's done over so many years to put Islamic finance at the top of the academic agenda. And if I may say so, he's a good friend of mine. So now let me then move to the work of the evening. The title of the lecture this evening, of course, is Revitalising Islamic and Social Finance, Rising to Current Humanitarian and Development Challenges. And we've often tried in the past, and I'm glad to say we've succeeded this evening in having two rather different approaches. From one side, the academic side, if you like, and on the other side, from the practitioner side. And let me take a moment to introduce our two distinguished guests. Professor Siraj Sait is the director of the Center for Islamic Finance, Law and Communities at the University of East London. He's a graduate of the Universities of Madras, Harvard and London, and is a well-known human rights lawyer and development expert. In his work with UN Habitat, UNICEF, UNHCR, FAO, the World Bank and governments, he's worked on development goals and post-conflict responses in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and other countries. His publications on Islamic law and gender have been highly ranked for impact in the Research Excellence Framework for 2014. Professor Sait will explore the potential contribution of Islamic development finance to address humanitarian challenges and sustainable development goals, especially in post-conflict situations. He believes, as he'll tell you in a moment, I'm sure, that Islamic finance could be a game changer in scaling up pro-poor community implementation of economic, social, and environmental development. Our second speaker tonight is Mr. Aamir Rehman, who is a managing director at the Fajr Capital Group. Fajr Capital is a private equity group that has deployed nearly $700 million in private equity. He's also the author of two books, Gulf Capital and Islamic Finance, and Dubai and Co., both published by McGraw-Hill. Mr. Rehman holds undergraduate and master's degrees from Harvard University, as well as an MBA from Harvard Business School. As I'm sure he will tell you when he follows Professor right? His discussion is going to focus, after Professor Sait, on the need for a paradigm shift in thinking about the Islamic financial system to embrace alternative business models with greater social impacts. So, Professor Sait, I ask you to speak.
Justice Blair, thank you very much for your kind words, and to LSE for organizing this. Professor Nazim Ali for organizing, as well as my old professor from, not so old, but I mean my first professor from Harvard Law School, Frank Vogel. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic today, Islamic development finance, is not new. The world has an anxiety not so much on the comprehension of what are the challenges or how to solve them. And there are many foot soldiers ready to do them. The biggest problem that we face today with the Sustainable Development Goals is that they're not merely ambitious, but they're very expensive. In fact, if you can look at the goals along with the targets and indicators, this is a massive operation that is intended until the year 2030. Read the Sustainable Development Goals along with the major initiatives underway to solve the world's problems, whether you're talking about climate change, whether you're talking about sustainable development generally, onward to Sustainable Urbanization Conference down the year, and also broadly in terms of reconstruction, rehabilitation efforts and humanitarian crises across the world. If you look at conflicts, if you look at disasters, you look at refugees, and so on and so forth, you can almost hear Baroness in a few buildings away from here right now telling us that you can have all the pious thoughts and noble intentions and moral arguments about refugees and solutions to problems. Unless you have the capacity, the resources, and the funding, you cannot move back. I said that the Sustainable Development Goals are expensive because they're much bigger than the Millennium Development Goals. Indeed, the whole old argument about 0.7% gross national income on aid is an old hat. It runs in billions. And what we really need to move forward is really in trillions. We need approximately $2 or $3 trillion every year to move forward. So we've had, since the 2002 Monterrey conference onwards to Doha in 2008, in 2015 we had a meeting again, a major conference to look at how we can finance and move forward and make the changes through the SDGs. And you can imagine that there were some breakthroughs in terms of spending targets, what's called the social compact, more taxes, but the whole emphasis has moved on to need for private investments and a diverse form of flow of funds that come in. So look at the fact that we're looking at money amounting to almost 15% of annual global savings, 4% of world GDP that is needed. And in the background of the kind of economic slowdown that we are having, the war, the security, the disease, the war construction, this is a huge ask. And some of us in this room are coming back from Nairobi and attending what is fancifully called the first conference on Islamic finance in Africa. And the whole theme really was, what can Islamic finance do, which conventional finance cannot? So the scope for private funding, or should I say the responsibility for private funding in moving towards making the international development agenda work is vital, absolutely. In fact, more than it was in terms of the MDGs. And I'm using the term Islamic development finance. You're familiar, of course, with the fact that it's different from conventional finance in structure, in terms of risk and profit sharing, but also ethical because of prohibition on certain forms of investment. We use the term Islamic development finance a little more broadly than Islamic social finance, because it's not merely about philanthropy, namely waqf, zakat, microfinance, or micro-takaful, but we're talking about a range of instruments targeted towards specific outer goals. So there could be micro, macro, and a broad range of these, including Islamic social finance. It's broader than Islamic infrastructure finance in the sense that it's not just project-oriented or ad hoc, but it is more for public goods, public infrastructure, schools, services, and so on and so forth. A vital difference could very well be that project finance is geared towards maximizing returns, whereas as we will see in terms of IDF, we're talking about competitive returns, not always full, though this could very well be the case. Finally, it's not merely public finance, it is about public-private partnerships, and therefore it brings together a range of sources, objectives, and approaches. Now, whether we can speak about both of these in the same room is the vital question. On one hand, we talk about this massive funding gap in development funding as we move forward for development. No easy answers, but Islamic finance is clearly growing in terms of socially responsible investment, securitization, and new markets opening up, irrespective of what your take is on the sukuk market, which we know is wobbling a bit, but still considered to be very promising. Now, are we speaking of a paradigm shift over here? Are we talking about merely just rebottling, redirecting the existing and calling it something else? I think that we would need to think about how Islamic development finance can tap into the investors and resources that conventional finance cannot. That will be the added value. How we can draw those who are refusing to invest through conventional channels to do through Islamic finance. And how can we develop that range of innovative products that can reach target groups? So financial inclusion and governance is going to be quite crucial. And finally, Islamic finance is not going to work in terms of development goals unless there's a new way of doing business. So inclusion, governance, and tool-based approach is going to be vital, and a multi-stakeholder approach where there is a different model of tracking what is being spent, why it's being spent, and what is being achieved. Now, I'll just give you an example. We speak a lot in terms of SDG 5, which is gender equality. We know that that's quite broad about equality, non-discrimination, about participation, including things such as women's security and protection from sexual harassment and so on. If Islamic finance is to come into the area and make a meaningful difference in terms of SDG 5, it would need to invest right across the SDGs. And if you're talking about the industry itself, severe problems over there which has been pointed out. I mean, I have right at the bottom of it a recent report from Simpla Sharia which says that we need to address these issues of financial inclusion as well as participation at all levels, not just women as leaders or investors, entrepreneurs or bankers, but also women as the stakeholders and beneficiaries and as women in all contexts, recognizing the diversity of women. And therefore, the access to resources, not just seen as money alone, but looking at what they can in terms of land, property, and so on and so forth. So there are specific targets for Islamic finance at this point of time. And that mirrors what the SDGs is all about. When you look at this continuum of Islamic financial rights, where we talk about ethical, responsible, green, and Islamic in the same breath as I am right now, we are talking about that these the SDGs are not merely targets for the world, but the targets for Islamic finance itself. For Islamic finance to be itself, it needs to map itself on the SDGs because the key building blocks that we have are expected to be very useful in terms of financial stability, inclusion, and shared prosperity. The question that all of us will still have to answer is that whose goals are these? Are they sort of some Western conspiracy or useless exercise? What about the ownership within the Muslim world? Are the SDGs Sharia compliant? And most importantly, are they convergent with the Maqasid al-Sharia? Now, if you look at each one of these goals, and I think I need to leave some time for Aamir, so I will not go through each one of them, but you'll see that each one of these goals ultimately are related to the 5 important components of, as understood from the literature on Maqasid al-Sharia. Add to that the concepts of adl, haq, and public interest, and they drive through. Now, there's a lot of literature right now in trying to map the SDGs onto the Maqasid al-Sharia or the other way around. If you look at what is in fact your deen, how do you actually protect and your mal? What exactly is meant by life and its quality? How do you advance the intergenerational aspects? Or how do you fulfill your intellect and etc.? A number of these works, including Umar Kumar Chopra, for example, have found that you can correlate many of the concepts that are found in the SDGs. Now, you could do it differently. The language could be different. But the idea happens to be that the SDGs, in effect, do what the Maqasid al-Sharia would actually set out to do in a particular way. Now, so how would Islamic development finance actually work? Now, we know that there are different players. So there are investors, there are policy makers, there are bankers, and so on and so forth. Now, if there is to be initiated a choice in terms of what kind of investments need to be made by Islamic finance, either at the executive or shareholder level, this has to be assessed by the Sharia board using the Maqasid, not just technically compliance. Now, one of the fundamental debates that's taking place in today's world within Islamic finance is, when we speak about Sharia compliance, are we talking about mere technical compliance? Or are we talking about more broader? Now, this relates to not only the role of the Sharia scholars or their competence or their worldview, but much broader the sense of how the industry itself allows space for various stakeholders to operate. These investment choices ultimately do go to the Sharia boards, and from them on for implementation. But in the course of implementation, the way we design these products to make them inclusive, but also to achieve the objective that is set out and map onto the social goals and indicators, is going to be very important in case we are going to achieve. And we need to do that through not only the implementation rollout, but a constant evaluation and understanding of what have been the good practices, the pilots, and lessons learned. So assessing the economic and social indicators for this best practice. Now, which is why the SDGs are important, because not only do you recognize the objectivity of the objectives in a particular way, but you also use that methodology of using both those indicators as well as meeting those targets and being able to assess them. So therefore, in Islamic finance, I hope I'm not getting too carried away over here, but we are not always talking about the economic returns. We're also talking about the social impact, and for some, the spiritual, the moral returns. If you do that, then it's not always about maximizing one dimension of it, which is the competitive rate of return, and also supporting a Sharia goal which overlaps with the SDG goal. So an example that I'm going to give in a moment is the immunization of poor children. Should we make all the money possible, or would we be happy if, in case we get a reasonable right of return, which was always a principle driving Islamic banking, as my father used to once upon a time say, when I used to tell him, why are you marking up so less on your products when in fact you could be making more money than the guy next door? And he says, well, that's the difference. Now, once we have this whole plethora of choices, investment choices that are to be made, how do we exactly set the priorities? Namely, even among the SDGs, which is more important than the others? Those who have been writing in this field have actually looked at this and said the answers are there. Once again, if you understand the Maqasid al-Sharia in terms of the prioritization, are they necessities, are they complements, are they embellishments, and so on. Now take a typical scenario that you have. You've got an environmental problem which needs to be cleaned up over there. How would you prioritize it in terms of both the nature of the problem, the extent of the problem, the costs that are involved, what kind of intervention would come in, relating also to what is the maximum impact that's possible. So it has to be impact-oriented, which might necessitate some decisions to be made. And again, in a variety of contexts, you look at what is the obligation, personal obligation that you have. Where is it classified? Is it mandatory, recommended, prohibited, detested? That would actually guide you to, of course, stay away from bad things and do the good things, the proactive approach of Islamic finance. And that relates to a much more broader concept. If you look at the state as a welfare state, with both the Baitul Mal as well as the Maslaha, you will see that the role of the individual and the state, including, of course, the more resourceful and able elements, get into a very different dynamic that is possible. Now, I'm just going to run through some of my own experiences. In 2004, working in Afghanistan in the post-construction effort, and also in Indonesia, we saw that there were numerous opportunities that arose for Islamic finance. Islamic finance was very nascent at that point of time. But the point to be noted is that we often look at Islamic finance as merely about funding and not taking a holistic approach. Whenever you look at, for example, waqf, or you look at Mewat land being empty land, It is quite a remarkable principle, which is use it or lose it, which is all about food security and so on and so forth, which is that if there's an empty land that can be enlivened by someone, then that individual gets rights over that land. Finance through Islamic modes, it becomes a very powerful weapon. So I don't think Professor Nazim Ali would remember, but you were there also at that particular conference, 2007 at Harvard Law School, when I spoke of Islamic microfinance, the unofficial discourse, where even though the whole argument was portrayed as a conventional microfinance, the Islamic microfinance through practice and customary means had actually come in. The community approaches had gone up. I had an opportunity a few years ago to be the head of the UN Evaluation Commission for Iraq, looking at the host of UN development programs taking place, which go into trillion. There was not a single mention of the word Islamic, either in funding or land or anywhere else. And going back and evaluating the programs, we know that the whole $1 trillion just evaporated and unraveled because lack of ownership, the lack of adaptation to the local context, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, a more recent experience I had was as chair of the drafting commission for laws in Somalia with the Prime Minister, President, Justice Office. For almost a decade, UNDP, with all good intention and incredible people, had worked on coming out with a legal framework for Somalia, but it did not work because there was always a suspicion among the Somalis whether this was halal, whether Islamic principles were there. The moment we managed to get through that and look at the compatibility issues, not merely with the letter of the Sharia alone, but more broadly with the spirit of it, we had the laws in a matter of few weeks and regulations issued. So the concept of Islamic it can be problematic. I can assure you that if I go to my old country, United States, and say, I'm here to do Islamic finance, I'm not going to get through the immigration itself. But if we are going to call it ethical, responsible, or green, then we need to prove it. And the SDGs gets an opportunity for us to say that it's a priori, that is objective. That's not mere wishful thinking. Look at the amazing success stories which the practitioner in Aamir was going to talk to you in a moment. Whether it be Maybank and Moneytree in Malaysia, Dawood Bikari for INSAFE just tweeted me this, in primary education and financial literacy in Malaysia. Look at the enormous success of the 2014 500 million health vaccine sukuk on the immunization of children. You have now the World Bank and the IDB coming up with a sukuk for reconstruction, recovery, and refugee relief. When IOFI says there are 14 types of sukuks, I think there can be probably 24 of them, and some of them are going to come in the area of development finance in the near future. The green sukuk is being developed. We have examples of socially responsible investment, and so on and so forth. So where are we right now? The whole idea of asset-based financing and risk-sharing model is working out, and there's a lot of traction if we can promote it. But the battle is going to be between the minimalists, the technically obsessed people who talk about Sharia compliance as merely being the letter of the law, or those who understand that Mahasid al-Sharia requires you to do much more than that, obligation of states, individual obligations, in a priority that we can use. These are small examples that we have, but we are talking about the SDGs. The scaling up is going to be important in terms of documentation, piloting up, replication, and rollout, and so on. That's going to require capacity, resources, and financing. We're not talking about redirecting flows. We're talking about inherent capacity for Islamic development finance to generate that. And if the vaccine sukuk and many of the others, the SRIs, are able to prove anything, it is that there are a number of people who are willing to accept a reasonable and competitive rate of return, even though this is not pure philanthropy. And I have always been reminded that Islamic banks are not merely supposed to be benevolent banks giving out loans. They're there to make money. But there's money to be made in development as well as social impact being there. Finally, I also was thinking about the Green Sukuk Working Party, which brings together a number of different expertise: project development, environmental, capital markets, compliance, Islamic finance. If we are going to work towards Islamic development finance, it's really going to be through inclusion, gender inclusion, youth responsive, and ensuring that the best of the talent comes forward. But governance in terms of bringing the legal, as well as the industry, as well as the economists, and the whole range of professionals together. The academics, the grassroots, the policymakers all need to be on this table. Thank you very much. I think that Islamic development finance is something that all of us are doing in many ways. The challenge for us is to scale it up and to map it against rather rigorous tools, which are professional tools, but also be able to be objective about where we are and how we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sait and Mr. Rehman.
How much time would you like me to take? Just 20 minutes. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalam ala Rasulullah, Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. On my way here, I passed by a number of theaters. And so I commend you for choosing to come here when you had many more entertaining options to spend your evening. But all jest aside, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your chairmanship. Dr. Ali, Professor Ali, thank you for organizing this event. And Professor Sait, thank you for your comments, which I believe have laid the groundwork very well for our discussion. I'm particularly honored that this is the 10th such lecture in the series. And as a number of you may be aware, there have been some very pioneering practitioners who've addressed this forum in the past, including the Secretary General of the Islamic Financial Services Board, the Chief Executive Officer of Khazanah Nasional Berhad, which is Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund, and the CEO of HSBC, which is where I used to work. So it is for me a great privilege to be following them up in this excellent tradition. There's a saying of the Prophet Muhammad where he describes a scene on the Day of Judgment, where God addresses a human being and he says, "O son of Adam, I was sick and you did not visit me." And the human being responds and says, but how could I visit you when you are the Lord of the world? And God responds to him, "Did you not know that such and such servant of mine, meaning such and such person, was sick? Had you visited him, you would have found me there." And the story continues, where God says, "O son of Adam, I was hungry, and you did not feed me." And the response is the same, that God, how could I feed you? You're the Lord of the world. Did you not know my servant was hungry? If you had fed him, you would have found me there. And it goes on, the next part of the hadith talks about thirst. And it's very powerful, because I believe the moral imperative that we have for humanitarian action and for development work, as Professor Sait has said, is very fundamental. It's fundamental to the Islamic tradition, it's fundamental to the Christian tradition, to the Jewish tradition, to Hindu and Buddhist. It's really something that's shared across all of our faith traditions. But it's really important to recognize that our entire industry, and I speak as a practitioner, exists on the basis of a certain ethical outlook in which contribution to humanity is very fundamental. So in the time that I have, I'll just make a few comments. As I mentioned, the humanitarian and development imperative is very compelling. So I know this would be very well understood by all of you. What I'd like to particularly highlight is that Islamic finance has been recognized, as Professor Sait had rightly pointed out, as part of the solution, more so now than before. Part of that is a recognition that a great bulk of the beneficiaries of current crises are part of the Muslim community. And the international community is asking, what is the Muslim world doing to help these other fellow Muslims? And it is a fair question, and there's a great deal of opportunity for us as an Islamic finance industry to be part of the solution. And just, I had the great joy and privilege a couple of weeks ago of meeting Ban Ki-moon in Dubai, because the UN has launched a report for humanitarian financing. They convened a high-level panel for humanitarian finance, and one of the opportunities that they identified was Islamic finance. And they launched this report, indeed, the whole report, not just the Islamic finance bit, in Dubai, recognizing the importance of the Muslim majority world in contributing to these crises, or contributing to the response to the crises, I should say. So it is a timely topic, and one, as I say, that I think is a very clear imperative. Now, this is really the core of the comments that I'd like to share, and I will be strict about the time in order to enable us to have a discussion. And I look forward to hearing your comments and questions. As a practitioner, which is the role that I'm playing this evening, there are three basic responses that I see us taking as an industry. And each of these I'd first like to explain, and I'll give you some examples and then close with some thoughts on this. The first is what I call the broad view approach, which is to say that the humanitarian and development objectives, the maqasid of Sharia, as were highlighted by Professor Sait, are fundamental to why this industry exists. It's very important that we play our part, and that's quite critical. So this view says that our existing institutions need to be more socially conscious, and we need to respond well. And how this manifests itself is, for example, CSR, corporate social responsibility, grants that are made by Islamic banks and other Islamic institutions, community programs, and lots of different ways in which our core Islamic financial institutions are involved. And this, as I said, is a broad view approach, which says we exist to do more than generate a profit. The key risk, in my view, of this approach is, does it blurry the mandates of the institutions that are created? Professor Sait was right to say that Islamic banks have been created first and foremost as profit-making institutions, while also upholding Sharia guidelines and ensuring they do so in a permissible way. And so, to me, the challenge is, where does CSR end and where does mandate creep or scope blurriness arise? So that's the broad view. This contrary, maybe the other side of this is the very focused approach, which is to say that every institution has a particular mandate. When it comes to Islamic banks and Islamic investment funds, at least the vast majority of them, they exist to generate a profit, and therefore that profit motive has to be honored and recognized. And this is important. I mean, I do not mean to suggest there's anything unethical about this approach, because even if we look in the Islamic tradition, it's very important for a person to recognize the role and function he's playing. So in the classic, for example, mudaraba contract, there's a provider of capital, he gives capital, or she gives capital to a business person. That business person has a very specific mandate, which is to go out and do something. If they swerve from that mandate, even if it's something that looks socially beneficial, if it is contrary to the instructions that they were given, it is unethical. So it's important to recognize the fiduciary responsibility of all of us. And the example I would give for this is Jack and the Beanstalk. How many know the Jack and the Beanstalk story? It means either your children are grown or you're not reading enough stories to them. But Jack and the Beanstalk is a great story where Jack has to go out. Jack and his mother are poor. The mother asks Jack to go sell their cow because they need the money. He meets someone on the way who says, I will exchange for you, I'll give you some magic beans in exchange for the cow. And he sells the cow. And when he comes home, his mother is furious because she said, I told you to go sell this cow for money, and you came back with 3 beans. Now, thankfully, it's a good, happy ending because the beans do turn out to be magic. She throws them out the window, and the beanstalk is grown. But, that's an example of swerving from your mandate, which is something to be careful about. The third approach is the most nuanced, and I'll spend more time on that. That's the adaptive approach. And what I call the adaptive approach is when we seek to integrate social objectives into our mandates, when we do so in a way that bakes in social metrics and other key criteria, and creates business models that are more hybrid in nature, more complex, if you will, in what they're trying to achieve, but at the same time more explicit regarding their social impact and their humanitarian benefit. I think, in my view, this is a very important step. This is where I believe, as an industry, we need to spend time reflecting and moving towards, is an adaptive approach, where we have institutions that take on explicitly a mandate which is commercial, but also has humanitarian and development ends to it. And the reason why I like this approach is because I do believe it's very sustainable, which is important. And also it reflects a general spirit of business that we're moving towards. And I think it's very important because, especially in my work, I get to interview a lot of young people who are interested in working not only in Islamic finance, but just generally in the investment world. And it's amazing to me how important social impact is to people, to young people today. And I think that's healthy and good, and that should be honored. And I think an adaptive approach to business models would work very well. The key drawback, as the slide says, is that there are 2 steps of creativity required here. And what we must appreciate, as somebody, I'll tell you, who works very closely with Islamic investors and shareholders, is that taking the step from conventional to Islamic is a step of creativity. It's a leap that's taken. And when you take another step further around social impact or humanitarian benefit, it's a second step. And taking 2 steps from the familiar is a lot more difficult than one. So this requires a certain path of evolution. So the adaptive approach, what are the dimensions where I'm suggesting some adaptation is required? And Professor Sait, again, has touched on some of these issues. But in our current approach, as I'm sure most of you know, we focus on compliance with texts, our Islamic texts, the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet, and the compilations of our scholars over the years and centuries. And that is a very important task that we do. If we move toward this more adaptive approach, we need to keep that. I mean, we need to recognize that the textual compliance with our Islamic law, our Islamic canon, is what makes Islamic finance Islamic. But beyond that, looking at empirical data, social impact, that is a skill set, that's a set of metrics, that's a set of it's an understanding or methodology which is new to us. And we as an industry need to learn more about that. The second point is on negative screening processes. So our screens in the investment world, generally the traditional screens we have are negative in nature, meaning we cannot invest in certain industries that are screened out. We cannot invest in companies with income above a certain threshold. They are screened out, so on and so forth. In terms of positive screening, do we have a positive bias or positive screen towards companies that create more jobs? Do we have a screen towards companies that employ more women? Do we have a screen towards companies that have more higher environmental standards? Generally, we do not, although there are some innovative and very important funds in that area. But as a general rule, the industry has yet to make this step, and I think it's an important part of what we can do under this adaptive approach. Our social and development projects are significant, but I think it's safe to say they're generally ad hoc in terms of what we do. So we'll do them on the side, whereas a more structured, integrated approach for development activities is what we need. And we're very good. I think we do have the tools available to do that in the industry, to have specific guidelines and rules about how much goes where, etc. It's just a question of us using them. And the last and probably most important point is investor expectations. We are a private equity firm, as Justice Blair highlighted. So we are investors first and foremost, and as investors we have expectations. And setting those expectations is very important, and managing them is very critical. So we need a mindset amongst our investors that recognizes and appreciates social impact. Again, the good news is that this is not going to be very difficult for our investor base to grasp. They are motivated by Sharia compliance, which is important, and I think that means that they can take this step, but it is a significant step away from what they may be used to. In terms of illustrative examples of what do I mean, or how can these be used, each of these approaches, I think, are very important and valuable. So I don't mean to suggest that we need to drop any of these or only focus on one or two of them. But let me start with a broad view. We need to be more creative about our CSR and development work. Bank of America had a great initiative for their in the retail banking in the U.S., which was called Keep the Change. Keep the Change was when you swipe your debit card, let's say you purchase something for $7.85. What Bank of America would do is round it up to the nearest dollar. So it would round it up to $8. And that extra 15 cents would go to your savings account. And the idea was it was a simple way to promote savings and get people to save more. And customers were actually quite surprised and pleasantly surprised to see, well, I didn't think I could save any money, but just by Keep the Change, I see I'm saving $10 a month or $5 a month or $50 a month. And that got them going. Now, of course, we could do that in a philanthropic or humanitarian way. So for every swipe, whatever the next dollar amount or sterling amount is, that balance is utilized for charity. It's a very simple, straightforward way of doing it, and probably you would not miss that bit of wealth. That's one example. Giveaways. Banks do a lot of promotions and giveaways, and I'm very proud of the bank we have in Brunei. Fajr is an investor in a bank in Brunei called Bank Islam Brunei Darussalam. And one of the things this bank did is, instead of having raffle-type giveaways, what they do is a program called the Wish program, which is that customers send in applications and say that if I got 100,000 Brunei dollars, what would I do with it, and how would it have a positive impact on my community? So, I might do a center for children, serve underprivileged children, or I might do something to support wildlife, what have you. And then there's a committee, it reviews these applications, and it gives out that grant. And it's a way of showing that they're interested in promoting good community activity, and it's not just a giveaway, but it's something more thoughtful in terms of community impact. So that's under the broad view. I think there's lots that can be done if we're creative about it. The focused approach, we need to create specialized institutions that do this work, the very good work of humanitarian and philanthropic work. Professor Sait rightly said that when you ask most commercial, private sector Islamic finance professionals, they'll say development work is fantastic, humanitarian work is fundamental, however, it's not my mandate. That's not why we were created as an institution. I was not created to do that. I might do a lot of that with my personal wealth, but I just can't do it from the platform where I am today. Our response to that, in my view, if we stick with the narrow approach, is to say, well, we need to create then those institutions. We need to have, more innovative zakah collection and distribution mechanisms. We need waqf or Islamic endowments, which are more creative in what they do. I'm very fortunate to be working with the United Nations right now on some work around Islamic social finance and how to integrate that into the humanitarian system, and it will be through specialized entities that are focused on this, created for this purpose, and they're good at it. Because another risk I didn't talk about in the broad approach is as much as we might be well-resourced to do things in the development humanitarian space, if we are bankers by training or investors by training, we may not have the skill set required to be successful in our philanthropy. So Warren Buffett set a great example for us, for example, when he partnered with Bill Gates and said, I'm good at making money, I'm not so good at philanthropy. So let me give it to somebody who knows how to do this better than I can. So I think that's very important. So that's the focused approach. And then the adaptive approach is to say, we need to have institutions with these hybrid sets of objectives, social impact investment funds. We at Fajr have joined the Global Impact Investing Network, which we see as a step, towards being more cognizant and more explicit about social impact. We also see a great opportunity for that convergence between Islamic finance and social investing. That's a big space, far bigger. It's estimated that the socially responsible investing space is about $10 trillion. Islamic finance at best is at $2.5 trillion. So there's a lot of volume there of capital. And so that's one example. We need to partner with institutions and stakeholders who are already committed to social impact. I think we do have a challenge in our industry. And for those of you who are present here, for example, I see Haris Irfan here is one of the leading experts on the Islamic finance industry. We tend to be very insular. And so we talk to each other and then we expect each other to change. Whereas I think a more healthy approach is if we are interested in social impact, let's find the institutions and individuals who are already out there interested in this and work with them. And in my experience, they tend to be very receptive to partnering with us. And I think that opens a whole universe of relationships that will be very helpful for us. In terms of defined allocations for humanitarian and development activities, one of the great things about the private equity business model, for those of you who are familiar with it, is that we have these very nice mechanisms called waterfalls. Anybody familiar with a waterfall? And the waterfall means after we've generated our return and met our hurdles, where does the excess profit go? And the bulk of it goes to the investors, and a chunk of it goes to management, and that's the traditional model. Another good model, and I'm very pleased that Fajr has embraced this model, is that to have a corporate foundation attached to that in the waterfall, which means the first part of the profit goes to the investors. That's sacrosanct. Beyond that, there's a piece which is shared. Some goes to management and some goes to the foundation. And this is not something that we decide after we've made the money. It's decided at the time when we raise the fund. So when we raised our fund starting in 2007 and closing in 2009, these were the rules of engagement. And therefore, there's a defined allocation, and it can be done. Professor McMillan is here. Who's a great pioneer in structuring Islamic structures. And we're very, as I said, we have great experience in doing structures, and there's nothing that keeps us from having structured responses like this. And finally, in a couple of points, in the minute I have remaining. We can work with staff, so using our staff to do philanthropic work and actually allocating that as part of their responsibility. And finally, when we recruit people, having this understanding of social impact and screening for that and encouraging that. Because again, I find it amazing that young people, we enter the financial world with a great deal of enthusiasm and aspiration to do good, and something happens along the way where that wears off. And we need to do all we can to cultivate that, which is a very virtuous and I think admirable thing. In closing, I'd like to remind us, or let me ask the group, what is the opposite of Islamic finance? When you contrast Islamic finance, what do we say, what is it not? Sorry? Conventional. That's right, conventional finance. We say Islamic finance, conventional. So by definition, we should be unconventional. We need to think unconventionally. We need to recognize that we are not conventional by definition. So to have unconventional thinking, to question our business models, is actually our great legacy and heritage as an Islamic finance industry. And as a practitioner, I'm proud to be part of an unconventional industry, which I hope will move more towards social impact and addressing humanitarian finance needs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And there's a lot to think about within those two excellent presentations focused on the SDGs and ethical considerations and the broad view, the current focus view, and the adaptive approach. And I think really, from my perspective anyway, what struck me about both presentations was a kind of reaching out and reaching beyond. And I was very struck with that coming from both sets of remarks we've heard. Now, so far as questions are concerned, it's an opportunity really to put to our two speakers points that you may have. And as you see, we have two microphones and one hand already. And just before I ask you, sir, to ask your question, can I say that what I will invite, if I may, are a series of questions. So we'll starting with you, sir, and then I'm going to ask for some others, and then we'll put it to our two panelists and see what they say. It would be very good if people would just very briefly introduce themselves.
Mohammed Amin, I'm a retired tax specialist focused on Islamic finance. I've been thinking during the presentation about the question of whether Islamic finance can help at all in what I see as the main problem of developing countries and poor countries generally, which is the lack of a rule of law, poor quality governance, and corruption. Do you think Islamic finance can actually help to change that or not?
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. So some other, yes, there's yes, sir, and then over there.
My name is Iqbal Asari. I teach at Islamic Finance here. So I think when we have worked on MDGs before with the World Bank and so on, and now the SDGs and so on, and Islamic finance is also, I think, opportunistically wanting to ride on the ESG bandwagon. Okay, but let's look at the SDG problem. I think there are two, from Islamic finance angle, there are two fundamental issues we need to resolve. One is that as it is, the jurisprudence is fixed on specific rulings. So it doesn't take into account the collective impact of those rulings.
Mm-hmm.
We give you a very simple example. If I go to a Sharia scholar and say, Sheikh, I'm going to open a KFC here. Everything will be halal and so on. So he will say, may Allah bless you, you make the best. However, if everybody opens KFCs, the whole society becomes obese,
Correct, yeah.
which has happened in parts of Birmingham and other places. So now, at what point does a KFC become not permissible? So the transition from halal to tayyib, wholesome, is a very complex one we need to resolve in Islamic finance if we want to move in that direction. The second issue I have is that sustainability itself only comes with a long horizon, whereas investment appraisal as it is now is based on discounted cash flow, which only values near-term cash. So by definition, your investment appraisal methodology is anti-sustainable. So we need to really think of how to fundamentally review how we appraise investments, right? To make sustainability as part of, especially if you want to bring the private sector in, as soon as you go to some place and say, I want funding, they do an investment appraisal, no payback in 3 years, and so go home. And I'm saying, look, this payback is 15 years here, and there is no room for that. If you don't do that, I don't think you will get funding for what you are looking at.
Thank you. A great deal to think about there. Thank you very much. And one other question there, and then I'm going to ask our two panelists to respond.
Oh, sorry. Hello, my name's Richard Gunn. I'm from the University of East London. I'm a law student. I'm currently working on a project with a company called ENEI on diversity within the workplace. Now, we talk about an idea of mandate and adaptability within financing. And what I wonder is whether banks and financing can use that as a way to encourage sustainable development within the workplace and within equality and diversity within those workplaces. The reason I talk about this is that currently there is a committee in Parliament that's considering the accessibility for Muslims within the workplace because they're some of the least paid and least accessibility to higher roles within business. And what they're trying to look at is how to tackle this issue. How can you encourage business to reach diversity goals, to go beyond the Equality Act 2010 and actually give accessibility to people, and whether finance can encourage those kinds of development?
Very well. Well, thank you. Professor Sait, first to you.
I thought all three questions were excellent. Thank you very much for them. From a tax point of view, I think the rule of law is both a question of how strong the systems of compliance are, but also the willingness of people in terms of their ethical, moral approaches and so on and so forth. So I think Islamic finance helps in the sense it brings together both the fear of the government and the fear of the God to the prudent levels that are there. I think that I don't know whether a systematic study has actually been carried out in this regard, but certainly the emphasis has been that if we are going to make systems more transparent and the products more adaptive, then I think there's going to be greater acceptance and sense of participation from the people themselves. Yeah. As far as the second question is concerned, Iqbal, I'd like to say that the challenge that you talked about that businesses face in terms of short-term investment appraisal methodology is not something unique just to businesses. I mean, working, for example, within the United Nations and looking at how do you measure impact, again, is hugely problematic. I mean, in a field that we work with, and I think I have a colleague of mine also over here, is that it sometimes takes 20 years, 30 years to make change. So I think it's a general methodology problem related to impact and sustainability. And also, you also hit the nail on the head when you talked about the KFC problem, which says that much of what we do is so ad hocist. And whereas mapping it onto something a little bigger and different parts of the game, knowing what is happening on the other side, helps in getting this holistic and sustainable approaches. And finally, in terms of diversity, I think that this is what we are talking about at this point of time. how can we make not only the industry itself, the Islamic finance industry, more diverse in terms of both gender as well as age and other opportunities that are there, but also see the outcomes that at present, I think Aamir would be in a better position to say it's those who are well positioned, who are able to invest, are able to reap the benefits. Those who are outside the boardroom or the investing structure don't get a chance to get in and make the money. What Islamic finance is trying to do is do that. And I keep coming up with the statistic, which is quite shocking for me. 72% of Muslims across the world are unbanked, are outside any formal structure. So if Islamic finance is anything at all, and I think, Ahmed, you started off by saying, what is it and how we need to be unconventional. I think a priority should be in some way or the other to try to reach out to that. And I think every investor, apart from the profit-making expectation that is there, should also be expected to ask those questions to the management as well as shareholders. Thank you.
Sure. Well, Chairman, with your permission, I would say a word about the questioners. So Muhammad Amin, as he introduced himself, is not only a tax specialist, but one of the foremost, probably the foremost tax expert on Islamic finance, and has helped countries all around the world on this. And the other questioner, Iqbal Asaria, I was just asking him whether it's hundreds or thousands of students in Islamic finance. So these are indeed esteemed questioners, and you, sir, as well. Your question is equally welcome. Now, if I can start with Muhammad Amin's question, there is a view that says that Sharia governance adds a layer of governance which strengthens overall transparency and corporate governance. I would not want to overstate that. So I would not want to argue that there's something inherently about Islamic finance that would necessarily address the question you're talking about, although in theory, yes, there is an extra step of governance. As a practitioner, what I see is the FDI element, the foreign direct investment element. So if Islamic finance, which we know for a fact, does foster investment between Muslim countries and Muslim economies, then to get foreign direct investment, rule number one is you need to have rule of law, you need to have transparency, you need to have property rights. So I think it's through the FDI channel, if you will, that Islamic finance will help, not so much because of its Sharia compliance. Regarding the KFC question, I find this fascinating because, again, in the presence of Professor Vogel, I will highlight something that he teaches in his class at Harvard Law School, which is there's an important difference between ifta and qada in the Islamic tradition. So qada is what, as Justice Blair does, he is which is rulings, public rulings, court rulings. So that is done with a view of overall public good. But it's also, of course, binding, and it's part of state policy. It's linked to state policy. And then you have ifta, which is fatwa, giving fatwas, which are actually specific to the context at hand. So one of the basic rules of a fatwa is that it only applies either to the person who's asked the question or people whose circumstances are sufficiently identical to that person that it's the fatwa applies. And of course, Mufti is in front of me. With that in mind, now going back to your KFC example, in my view, as a practitioner, not a legal scholar, nor of course a faqih, the circumstances change when you have 20 KFCs versus one KFC. Therefore, fatwa, the whole mechanism of fatwa is meant to be adaptive, to use the word I used before, and contextual in nature. So as to say, can the fatwa be different today than it was for the person who asked this question 10 years ago? Certainly it can. And that's why I think this level of nuance is very important, because people criticize the Sharia scholars. For example, when this Sheikh Taqi Usmani had said that I find the sukuk to be impermissible, and people say, well, wait a second, you used to think they were permissible. It's a misunderstanding not of the fatwa, but of the basic concept of fatwa, which is fatwa is time-bound and specific, things change, and he has every right to change his view. Justice, I'm sorry I've gone a bit off course, but I think it's a very important conceptual distinction. So I think a mufti can change his view based on social circumstances, and that's exactly the kind of adaptive view we talked about. Sir, to your question about sustainability and inclusiveness in the workplace, that's an example of positive screening. So if you have an investment fund that says we want to particularly invest in companies that have workplace inclusion, that's great. And I think that that's a good example of how capital can use its power to influence social change, and I think it's a very worthy goal.
Thank you. Question there, a question there, and a question there. I'll continue to take it in threes, if I may.
Hello, hi. Great presentation from both of you. Thank you very much for that. My name's Aamir. I work for a social investment fund here in London, and Aamir, what you said is just thoughts I've been having for the last few years, and I'm glad someone else has brought up social impact and Islamic finance. And I guess my point's very much, specifically more towards kind of what you were saying, and I mean, almost on a weekly basis when it comes to impact and how we go about measuring it in the industry I work in, it's evolving and changing on such a regular basis. And what wasn't clear to me was, do you see where Islamic finance is right now, do you see it as coming in and shaping the way impact measurement is currently structured, or do you expect Islamic finance to take on board what the sector is doing and integrate it within the way it allocates capital? And that, I guess, wasn't clear to me as to kind of where does Islamic finance play that part, because I think it would be useful for it to be at both ends, essentially shaping the way you go about measuring impact, but also how you go about allocating it.
Thank you very much. Yes, that was.
Tahir Zaman, thank you for your presentations. Most welcome. Just want to ask Aamir about the humanitarian imperative and Islamic finance. You on one of the early slides, you showed that most people are in protracted refugee sort of situations for 17 years or so, and given that we've seen a large movement of people from across the Middle East and beyond into Europe, precisely because they no longer want to stay in a situation where they are dependent on humanitarian relief. And my work is very much around refugees and speaking to refugees, that they look to move beyond the gaze of humanitarian regimes and to seek, arguably, what we all have, that is the right of citizenship. Okay? Given that, then how does the Islamic perspective map onto a regime which many people within forced migration studies and in around humanitarian work have recognized that humanitarianism in of itself is violence towards displaced people?
Very well. Well, thank you for that question. And there was another one back there. Yes, I'll come back after in a minute, but there's one there in the middle, and then I'll come back to you. So, yep.
My name is Haris Irfan.
You got the microphone?
Yes.
Yeah, good.
Haris Irfan. I work for an Islamic financial institution. I liked your closing remarks, Aamir, which is, what is the opposite of an Islamic finance institution? It's a conventional institution, and therefore we should be unconventional. But I think you appreciate the problem with that, which is that this industry is made up primarily of conventional bankers, and they wouldn't know how to be unconventional. So how do we fix that? And what's the solution? How do we ensure that we take on unconventional people instead of the very particular, specific demographic that we focused on?
Well, thank you. And I'm going to ask Mr. Rehman to answer, and then Professor Sait.
Sure. Well, the first question in terms of the sequence, if I've understood correctly, so where does the Islamic guidelines fit in vis-a-vis the social impact metrics? At present, I would say it's additive. So if you're familiar with the IRIS metrics, I would take the IRIS metrics and I would add to them Sharia screens. That's the simplest thing to do right now. And I believe as we evolve and we find more, I mean, there's some fascinating things in Islamic law which can point to business ethics, which we overlook. So I'll give you one small example. So according to Sheikh Nizam Yaqubi, from whom I heard this, one of the practices when you're selling a property is to offer it to your neighbor first in Islamic law. The first right of purchase, or right of first refusal, or right of first offer should go to the neighbor, which is, first of all, strategically very interesting because they're likely to want to buy it. But secondly, you can see why that is, right? I mean, it makes sense. If you're selling your home, you should offer it to somebody next to you. So that is something that you're not going to find in Iris. So I think we do have some gems that you can put in there. But for the most part, I would start with Iris. I would add the Sharia screens, and I would build it that way. Number one. Number two, and if I may also actually, and I think Professor Sait picked up on this point, it's very important. Like the UN principles for responsible investing. The Muslim world, in my view, Muslim majority view, needs to embrace these principles because I'm really surprised when I hear people talk about the UN, for example, and even the World Bank but the word UN is a better example, as being a quote-unquote Western institution. It is not a Western institution. It is a multilateral institution. There are 57 Muslim majority members. And it's as much a Muslim institution as it is a European institution. And certainly as a North American institution, there are only 3 countries in North America. So, I mean, that's important in my view. So in any case, so I think we should embrace the PRI because we are the UN. So anyway, the next question about the humanitarian financing and I'm not sure I completely understood your question. It seems quite profound about citizenship and legal rights. Professor Sait is far more qualified than me to speak of legal and property rights. But what I think, if I understood your question correctly, how do we ensure that the humanitarian action that we do does not have negative consequences for the? Is that the question, or?
No, I think the way in which we frame humanitarianism
Yes.
is quite normative.
Right.
And what we need to consider.
Mm-hmm.
The way in which they speak about those humanitarian interventions upon them is that this is somehow kind of violence. How does that fit ethically with, the
Right.
Islamicized?
Well, yes. I mean, so the basic response, is a basic principle of Islamic finance: la darar wa la darar. Don't cause harm, nor should you reciprocate harm. So, of course, if what you're doing is causing harm, then it's not humanitarian or ethical, I should say. But I don't know enough about that topic. I probably would leave it to Professor Sait, and maybe we can speak separately on it. But of course, if it causes harm, it's not beneficial. In fact, if I may, just on a text on that, the Quran says, "O you who believe, do not follow up your charity with something called man." And man is when you make people feel ingratiated towards you. So you say, "Remember, Aamir, when I gave you that car? Oh, you remember when I did you that favor?" So that the favor actually becomes a burden. So that's an example of where if you cause harm, it's actually very clearly prohibited in the Quran. All right, the last one in terms of Haris's question, and as I said, Haris is not. I mean, he's written a book on our industry called The Heavens Bankers, and it's a very insightful book about our industry and how it's evolved. How do we? I think this is a very delicate question, Haris, because I was just having a discussion earlier today that we do have a lot of Islamic finance training programs, and we haven't done a good job of absorbing those people in our institutions. So I'm reluctant to say we need standalone Islamic finance programs because that hasn't produced the result that we're looking for. So I think you need a conventional skill set with an unconventional mindset. And how you achieve those two things is challenging. But, attitudinal screening is something we all know how to do in interview processes. So the quick answer is to, look for that skill set, but also the mindset, and then screen for that more in our interviews. And certainly we could do more than what we're doing right now on that. But I think we do have a challenge in terms of how we develop our people because more specialized training institutions has not necessarily led to more absorption and more success in finding placements.
Thank you very much. Professor Sait.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, 3 very thought-provoking questions. The first one was on impact measurement and allocation. How do you actually measure what kind of metrics? And this goes down to the point that Aamir says that if we have been reluctant bystanders to the SDGs, and we haven't, and it's bit of fully engaged and then have worries about it, only if we fully engage can we actually contribute to the process of the targets, the indicators, and so on and so forth. So therefore, there are several Islamic dimensions and aspects of Islamic finance which are difficult to measure within the sort of conventional and traditional approach of impact measurement because there are value-added, social, and other factors. I think it can be done. So that's really a call that we need to look at what's on the table and how we can adapt it to the Muslim world and Islamic finance also. The second question from Tahir Saman was very good. I think when you talk about the Islamic perspective as a social narrative and so on and so forth, we see that in post-conflict situations particularly, customary and religious practices tend to come to the fore, obviously because of breakdown in formal systems or lack of faith in them. And therefore several practices actually emerge. Now this would logically lead us to believe that there would be a greater demand on Islamic finance, or there would be a greater propensity for that to be used. At some informal level, the informal alternate finance is available, but Islamic finance has not actually ventured into that. It's a strange kind of argument, because we were speaking to the bankers, I think several of us over here in Nairobi just a couple of weeks ago, and the perception of risk that is there, and given the way Islamic finance also works, tends to put off a number of investors and bankers and so on. I think we need to revisit it. So the point I'm making is that whereas there is a rich tapestry of practice of communities coping as well as innovating, I think the systems haven't actually reached out and bankers haven't reached out. It's not simply a question of thinking small and talking microfinance, but the kind of diversity of products that are required in these fragile communities is not there. I mean, I teach refugee law, and we teach some of the students together, and this is precisely what they say. How does it matter what you say about Islamic finance when really it's not there? And that leads actually to Haris's very important question: how do you become, unconventional? I think the best way to look at it is saying, what can Islamic finance do that conventional finance cannot? And that's a big problem, because I think that we are apologists in many ways, mimicking and sort of tinkering a little bit. We're not challenging the fundamentals, but in some ways I and all of us feel complicit in, because universities have actually been reproducing what they think the industry wants, and much worse than what the industry really wants. The Islamic finance education is stuck, whereas I think the industry has moved on. Now you try to put some sort of stopgap arrangements by having executive education programs or some sort of stand-up comedies and things like that. But it doesn't make up for the desperate need that we have, a crisis in the education. You probably all know this, that in many places the demand for Islamic finance has been poisoned by the sense that it's terrible to have an Islamic finance degree because the brand has been affected. So I think it's a responsibility of both the industry as well as the universities, the academy, to try to fix that. But I think I like the fact that Haris actually took it upon the industry and individual thinkers to consciously try to think. I mean, Mickey Mouse stuff. Sometimes in organizations, in meetings, you're asked, so what are the 5 things you would do differently? You know, how would Maqasid al-Sharia look like, instead of a question about whether it's technically compliant with the Sharia and so on. Challenge, an Islamic scholar to come and give you an assessment of what are the various considerations that he would like the bankers to use, because the role is often seen as only a tick box or yes and no. So it's about roles, but it's also about synergies. And finally, I don't think the bankers can think very differently just on their own. They need that traction, they need to play ball. And so there are the regulators out there, the civil society out there, the policymakers out there, which is why I think, as Aamir suggested, it's going beyond the mandates, but also sharing mandates with people who can do it better. So bringing everybody on the table, I think, is equally important here too.
Thank you for that. Now there was a hand up. Yes, sir. There's a question there, and a question up there.
Thank you. My name is Sylvia. I'm from the University of East London. I'm wondering about the role of Islamic financing in non-Muslim countries. Especially, I'm thinking about this in connection to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I believe would be very beneficial for developing countries. So where do you see the place of Islamic financing in such countries, and the role of the state in those countries to push this forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, the mic there, please.
Thank you very much, both speakers. My name is Dr. Mohammed. I'm also a graduate from University of East London. My question is mostly to Aamir. When you started your presentation, you quoted a very good hadith from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he talked about when did you feed my servant and things like that. And in the course of the presentation as well, you briefly made a comparison. You referred to the Baitul Mal, which operated at the time of Muhammad. My main question is this. During the time of Muhammad, the benefit of Islamic banking, which was espoused in the Baitul Mal, was felt almost immediately. But however, if I want to refer you to the question, the last question from the gentleman there, when he briefly mentioned about refugees, how will a common Muslim man on the street, for example, say a refugee who has been displaced for many years, feel the benefit or the impact of Islamic banking as it was during the time of Muhammad? Bearing in mind that in those days, I know things have changed a lot. It is not, these days, it's more about the investor. Say I invest in Islamic banking, just like you said before, my interest will come before those of others. So I will say a common man who has not invested, who just want to open a KFC chicken shop, benefit and feel the impact of Islamic bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that it?
Yes, hello. I would have a question for both of our distinguished speakers. Professor Sait, you have mentioned that that Islamic finance has to play a role also with respect to gender equality, and of course this is also recognized as a general goal by the by the United Nations, gender equality. At the same time, we see that in Islamic countries, let's say a country like Egypt, a few months ago when there was a first meeting between the newly founded Women's Entrepreneurs Association with one of the major banks there, the Bank of Egypt, organized by the EBRD, specifically mentioned to support women entrepreneurs. None of the representatives of that bank there actually was a woman. And this issue is indicative for that in the whole banking sector over there, probably gender development, even though it's high on the agenda, still has a long way to go. So I would like to ask you both to maybe share your views on how Islamic banking specifically can help women entrepreneurs to develop in these countries.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
Professor Sait?
Yeah, thank you very much. The first two questions were actually quite compelling. Sylvia's question was on how Islamic finance would be relevant to non-Muslims. And I think Mohammed asked about what about the non-investors, not just the investors, how does it affect Muslims in society generally? And finally, I'm going to take a little bit of time on this, not that much of time, but come to gender equality. To start with, let's take the example of Africa as a continent. You know, it is estimated that more than 1/3 of the population of Africa is Muslim. And not all of them in terms of formal Muslim sense and so on and so forth. So when you speak about Islamic finance, and this is how many of the African countries, including Uganda and Kenya, are looking at it, they're not looking at it from a religious point of view. They're looking at a very pragmatic, something that, if, for example, is for public infrastructure, would benefit all sections of society. And therefore, the number of participants, and several of us who were there at a recent meeting would recognize, there was almost, the majority of people were non-Muslims over there and from Africa. So there is an interest. I always like to use this provocative example of an organization called Women Living Under Muslim Laws. So this is a feminist Muslim organization which is not merely concerned about Muslim, because they're non-Muslims who live, who could be atheists, who could be agnostic, as much as they could be religious, but the laws affect them. So here we are talking about Islamic finance as creating the kind of social impact and following the SDGs to people irrespective of their faith or the name and so on and so forth. And likewise, our biggest complaint from the point of view of civil society about Islamic finance is that the products are developed on a top-down sort of boardroom level, not through the what you call process of multi-stakeholder, not understanding who the beneficiaries are, what they want. It's almost a sort of take it or leave it approach. And it has to move from that. Take, for example, women. Women have to adopt these, not gender neutral, they are gender biased in a certain sense, products which are not exactly made for them. The assumptions that are made about women, like they would like a certain kind of ethical component or dealt in a particular way. It's only now that market research is emerging, and women leaders within the industry itself are coming forward. And that, tying into the third question, And I think we have several experts in this room. I'd like to just recognize Osa Johnson from UN Habitat, who is the Gender Equality Officer, and we worked together in developing gender-responsive tools, which meant that every single product has to be not only affordable, scalable, gender-responsive, and so on and so forth, but you need to be able to actually evaluate it. So we developed within the UN a very successful tool, which is called a gender evaluation criteria. So every product, every program can actually have a set of 22 questions divided into the political, the governance issues, the economic, the social, and etc., and actually come with a scorecard which will be able to evaluate it. Not just evaluation, but monitoring on a regular basis. Now that also brings me to Naira, who's over here, as well as several people who are from IFES, who have prioritized gender equality, because this is not merely about empowerment of women. That will happen. But this is about empowerment of Islamic finance itself. We are flying on just one single wing. And it is all the more problematic because there's an assumption that the term Islamic is there. It excludes women. But it's not just a success of Islamic microfinance. But some of the biggest successes have been possible because women are able to increase the market share as well as make the products a lot more competitive and so on and so forth. So I think I said this in Nairobi. I said the future of Islamic finance in the hands of women. And in a place like Africa, it's not like in many other traditional societies that women have to be encouraged to play a role. Women are already playing. It's about removing the bottlenecks. So thank you very much, Stefan. I think a lot of the headlines about Islamic development finance would be about the SDG 5, which is about achieving the gender equality and financial inclusion and governance, which includes women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rehman?
Sure. So regarding Islamic finance in non-Muslim countries, it's important to distinguish between different modes of financing. So when we talk about equity investment, remember that there are certain screens, which I imagine you may be familiar with, about the level of conventional debt that companies have, et cetera, which, depending on the availability of debt financing in that country, may or may not make it possible or hospitable for Islamic investors. So, for instance, I was speaking with someone who's a very prominent entrepreneur in Africa about an infrastructure fund. And the countries he was targeting, most of them did not have Islamic banks and therefore didn't have Islamic debt facilities. And because infrastructure is heavily leveraged, there was a challenge in terms of how can you bring in Islamic equity when you don't have Islamic debt. So that was a very concrete example of it. But I think that the first step is actually on the reverse side, which is on the debt side. And if you're familiar with the sukuk market, many, if not most of our sukuk are actually pieces. So there's Islamic tranches within larger debt facilities. And so I think the way to do it, I would start with infrastructure because there's a huge scarcity of Islamic Sharia-compliant debt paper in the market. I would start with sukuk, and you have to create Islamic tranches, and then you go out and market that. I think that's a good starting point. But certainly the fact that they're non-Muslim countries is not a barrier in and of itself. It's just the issue of making sure that if it's an equity investment, there's enough Sharia-compliant debt. So that's on that one. Sir, I think your question was very well answered by Professor Sait. I just would raise an anecdote. So my chief executive and mentor, Iqbal Khan, used to work at an institution called Dar al-Mal al-Islami, Bahrain-based. And because of the similarity between the name Dar al-Mal and Bayt al-Mal, there was a great confusion at times about the mandate of this institution. So people would come looking for assistance from Dar al-Mal. And I think that gets to my point about the narrow focus. I mean, I'm glad you said Bayt al-Mal, because Bayt al-Mal is the public treasury, but the public treasury is a very different animal from a bank. But people sometimes get confused. So I mean, I think that's where the public treasury has a certain responsibility, and private banks have a different responsibility, and both have to fulfill their mandates. Regarding gender equality, I don't know, sir, if you're familiar with a fund. There was a fund done between DFID of the UK and the Islamic Development Bank for Arab SMEs that were female-owned, which was announced a few years ago. I haven't followed up on it, but if you're familiar with it, that would be an interesting example of a concrete step. And I think that does, that's a step in the direction, but of course there's more to be done. I would also, and this links to the question that was raised by you, sir, I think that female entrepreneurship is extremely important and it should be supported, but also women's access to the workplace is very important in large companies. And we need to do a lot more there in terms of having female-friendly or inclusive workspaces. Because we're losing, and this is very well known, that we're losing out on female talent, especially as they become mothers. We don't have the systems in place in many of the Muslim majority countries and key workplaces to retain them, and it's a big loss for them and for society as a whole. So I think female entrepreneurship, I agree with you, is important, and also maybe a more broad challenge is women in the workplace and how we can ensure that we don't lose out on their contribution.
Well, thank you for that. And one of the things that, as a judge, I tend to keep an eye on the clock. And I'm very impressed with not only our speakers, but actually our questioners too, who've kept both questions and answers within a good space of time. I thought it was a terrific discussion. I really did. We could have kept going for another hour, but they throw us out at 8 o'clock. You know. So I'm going to draw things to a close. I'm conscious that I've only got a very, very limited contribution I can make to the debate, other than just to feel very privileged to be part of it. From my perspective, as someone who's been in financial law for a very long time now, if I was asked to pinpoint something that I think anyone in finance, Islamic finance, conventional finance, or use any term you like, then I would say it would be the impact of technology. You mentioned the 70% unbanked, but that's of that 70%. Many, perhaps most, will have access to mobile technology, and this is going to make a huge difference over the next 10 years or so. So I think that's maybe another really, really big challenge to bear in mind. I think it fits very well with the kind of points you were making about trying to feed in ideas and try and open up to ideas, and that's always a good thing. So on behalf of everyone here, I'd like to really very warmly thank Professor Sait and Aamir Rehman for what were two really excellent contributions.